Martin, can you tell us the latest on Ian Huntley's condition? What do we know about the attack?
He'd been attacked in the prison workshop at Frankland prison by another prisoner. That prisoner had been identified. He'd suffered serious head injuries. There were unofficial reports that he'd been hit by a metal bar. One report suggested that metal bar had a spike in it. But I think all the indications were that he was seriously ill. How close he was to being killed, it's difficult to say. What we've been told officially and in other news reports, he is very seriously hurt. And whether they will be life-changing injuries, we still don't know at this stage.
This is not the first time that Huntley has been attacked in prison, though. Isn't that right, Martin?
Absolutely. I mean, he's been a target for other prisoners almost from the day, I suppose, from the day he went to prison. I mean, he is a child killer, and as such will always be vulnerable to attacks from other prisoners who, I suppose, in that twisted morality of prisons, think, okay, justice might have been done, but it's revenge that's really wanted and needed. He's been attacked at least twice. Once he had boiling water thrown at him at Wakefield prison some years ago. In fact, soon after he was jailed. And since he's been moved to Frankland, which is another high category top security jail, he had another very serious attack. He was slashed in the throat and needed a number of stitches. He will, as I say, always be vulnerable to attack.
I want to go back to 2002 and the reason why Huntley found himself in prison. How did a typical Sunday evening turn into one of the most desperate missing person cases in British history?
Well, two little girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, were good friends. They were 10 years old. It was the summer holidays and they were at Holly's house enjoying a family barbecue. And I guess we can understand that perhaps at some stage they got rather bored with the adult conversation and disappeared. The parents thought they were upstairs and hadn't checked on them for a couple of hours. But when they did in the early evening, they discovered that the two girls had gone out. It transpired that they'd gone out to buy some sweets. They were seen by a number of people heading into the village or the town, as Soham is. It's a rather unusual place and a place, of course, nobody had ever heard of until this happened. But the little girls were seen several times by witnesses, and then they simply vanished.
Tell us about the search then for the two girls in their Man United jerseys.
It was a massive search. I think initially there was something like 400 police officers were involved, but not just them. I mean, the whole community came together to try and find where these little girls had gone. And of course, the last picture of them showed them in those very distinctive, very vivid Manchester United football shirts. The search, as they always do, kind of expanded. There was one report of two graves being discovered in some woodland near Newmarket, a few miles away. They turned out to be badger setts, but it just shows you how every little potential sighting got the police very, very excited. And, you know, people all around the country followed the police investigation. I'd been a pupil at that school many years before, and frustratingly, I was on holiday at the time, but I followed it from afar. I mean, the whole nation, I think, was gripped by the potential plight of these two little girls. And as it went on, it became more desperate, and the chances of finding them alive became more remote. Their bodies weren't found for another 13 days.
It became a massive news story as well. And I would have been in and around the same age as Holly and Jessica when they went missing. And I have such a distinct memory of the police in the area getting two young girls that looked similar to Holly and Jessica, dressed in Man United jerseys, and walking them through the local town to try and jog people's memory. It really was such a massive news story.
Yeah, I mean, people were gripped. I mean, it's very unusual for two girls to go missing. I mean, it's very unusual for any young girl to go missing and not be found pretty quickly. I mean, most kids who disappear aren't away for very long.
Mm.
It's that photograph that was taken on the day they disappeared of the two of them, looking, very young and vulnerable, but in those very vivid Manchester United shirts, was an image that people, I suppose, kept in the forefront of their minds. And it was, of course, the school holidays. It was notoriously a time of very little news. So this was a story that was on the front pages for a long time.
Tell us about the school caretaker who was appearing in media interviews during the search.
Yes, Ian Huntley was the caretaker of the village college, the secondary school, where Holly and Jessica presumably were going to go, perhaps in a year's time. He featured in news stories because, I mean, for one thing, the police used the village college main hall, that I was used to many years earlier, as the venue for press conferences. And Ian Huntley was somebody who actually set out the chairs for the journalists at times of those police press appeals. But he also seemed to be inserting himself into the story. He would be giving interviews to the media. He always seemed to be around as journalists were going around the town looking for people to be interviewed. And of course, it soon emerged that he had been one of the last people to see the two girls alive. And a number of journalists knocked on his door and proactively asked about his encounter with the girls. And he told journalists that he had seen them. They had come past his house. He'd been outside washing his dog. The dog had got very muddy. And they'd spoken to him because his partner was Maxine Carr, who'd been a teaching assistant at the girls' junior school. And in one interview, he said that they came past asking for her, and he told her that she wasn't there. And he told them that she hadn't got the full-time job she'd been hoping for. And he told a colleague of mine live on Sky News that they said they were very sorry that Maxine hadn't got the job. And Huntley said then the two girls walked off in the direction of the library. But he spoke to other journalists as well, and he started asking journalists or saying strange things that made journalists suspicious. One, in fact, was so suspicious about what he was saying, how he had suggested how the two girls might have reacted if they'd been asked to get into a stranger's car for some reason. And this was a man who really didn't know the girls at all, and he was suggesting how each of them might have reacted differently to an approach by a stranger. So one journalist went to the police and said, "Look, this is a man who's acting bizarrely, oddly, and that may have contributed to him becoming a suspect eventually."
After 13 days of searching, what happened, Martin?
A gamekeeper about 10 or so miles away from Soham, near the Lakenheath air base, stumbled across two bodies, badly burned bodies, lying in a drainage ditch, and called the police. It emerged that this was an area that Ian Huntley knew very well. His grandfather had lived there. I think his father too had a house there. And of course, once the bodies were discovered, police went there in great numbers, along with science scenes of crimes, scientific officers, and so began the hunt for clues at that site where the bodies were found. There was a lot of forensic evidence. Eventually, the two girls' Manchester United shirts were found charred and cut up in a rubbish bin on part of the school site where Huntley was the caretaker. And fibres from those shirts were found on his clothes and in his car, and fibres from Huntley himself on his own clothes had were found on those kind of charred football shirts. In fact, there was something like 150 fibres had passed between them. But there was other stuff as well. I mean, there was an awful lot of forensic evidence that pointed very strongly towards Huntley. Soil from that site where the bodies were found was discovered on his car tyres, on the soles of his shoes. And one thing that puzzled police was that there were very high growing nettles around that ditch where the bodies were found, and there seemed to be no obvious pathway into the ditch. So police tried to discover how Huntley had got into the ditch, but they employed somebody who's become quite famous, Professor Patricia Wiltshire, who's a forensic ecologist and botanist. And she managed to show that there was a path that wasn't obvious to other people. There was a path through these nettles. She showed that the nettles had been trampled, but that then had sprung up and had regrown. So she was able to establish that. And of course there was pollen from that site, which was different to pollen in Soham, but there was pollen on Huntley's car and his clothes and so forth.
How soon after then was Huntley arrested, and what was his defence?
Well, he was arrested pretty soon after the discovery of the body. So too was Maxine Carr. His defence was that it was nothing to do with him. He pleaded not guilty at his trial, but of course, halfway through his trial, very notoriously, he did then admit that the girls had died inside his house. And I mean, he had to account for all the forensic links, and he told a bizarre story halfway through the trial, and I was there listening to it, and we were all rather gobsmacked. I mean, the weight of evidence was against him, and having denied everything, he suddenly said, yes, okay, the girls had come into his house because one of them had had a nosebleed, and then one of them had fallen into the bath and accidentally drowned as he attempted to save her, and the other girl had panicked and screamed, and in his efforts to try and stop her screaming, he had accidentally asphyxiated her. I mean, preposterous stuff, but that was eventually his defense towards the end of his trial, and of course the jury were buying none of it, and he was convicted.
You mentioned Maxine Carr earlier on. She was a teaching assistant that Holly and Jessica would have been familiar with. Can you tell me what her involvement was in that and what she was charged with?
Well, she was charged with perverting the course of justice and helping an offender. I mean, basically, she gave Huntley an alibi. She said that she had been with him at the house on the day that the girls had disappeared, that Sunday afternoon, and said that he wasn't involved. I mean, what later transpired was that she had been a long way away. She'd been in Grimsby visiting family, and there were people who came forward and said, yes, she was there. So that completely destroyed Huntley's alibi, and it showed that she had been lying.
You said earlier that during the trial you were gobsmacked at the story and what was coming out. What was the public's reaction throughout the trial and even after the arrest of Huntley?
I suppose one of the reactions was, well, here was a guy who, by all accounts, had been the last person to see the two girls. So why hadn't he become a suspect much earlier? And those who followed the trial, I think, given the weight of evidence, thought, well, he's banged to rights. Why on earth is he pleading not guilty? And when he suddenly changed his plea, well, not his plea, he admitted that he had seen the girls and they'd come into his house and they'd died in those two rather bizarre ways. I mean, nobody believed a word of it.
Mm. Following his arrest, it emerged that Huntley had a past.
Yes, I mean, this was one of the big issues at the trial. Why on earth how on earth had he ever got a job working with children in a school when he was well known to police? I mean, what rather complicated it was that he had no previous convictions, but he was known to police in Humberside. He'd been investigated a number of times for various allegations of rape, indecent assault on young girls, and burglary. And he was known as somebody who had an interest, had a number of girlfriends who were thought to have been underage. Now, when he applied for the job in Cambridgeshire at Soham Village College, he was vetted, but not very, very well. And whatever checks were done through Cambridgeshire police to Humberside police, um, they weren't done meticulously. Humberside police had this body of intelligence about suspicions around Huntley, but it was never passed to Cambridgeshire police in the way that perhaps previous convictions might have been. So it was soft intelligence, if you like. But the feeling was that if Humberside police had told Cambridgeshire police about the number of times Huntley had been investigated for a variety of allegations, but particularly because of, suspicions around his interest in young girls and the potential for a rape, of which he was never charged, then he would never have got the job, should never have got the job working as a caretaker in a school.
And was that essentially the focus of the Bishard Inquiry report?
Yes, it was. I mean, the Bishard report was set up um, after, in fact, the very day after the trial ended. I mean, it had to be held up because of that. It was essentially trying to answer the question, how on earth did he get his job at a school with his past? And it kind of delved into how child protection could be improved. Um, so that's essentially what it set out to do, and it came up with a number of recommendations that were implemented, and it was a big it was a big moment in child protection. It effectively led to the setting up of the police national database, which meant that police forces could collate and were encouraged to share that kind of soft intelligence about suspects who hadn't actually been charged or convicted of anything. It meant there was a much better sharing between police forces of intelligence. A code of practice was established to ensure that that swapping of material did happen. It set up a registration system for anybody who was applying for a job working with children or vulnerable people. It led to better training for head teachers and school governors on how to interview those people applying for jobs working with children. So it was a groundbreaking inquiry that really did stem from the lack of proper vetting that was done around Ian Huntley.
And there we will leave it. Martin Brunt, thank you so much.